11, my Amish wife asked to leave me. My father said a good husband never allows it. My name is Joseph Byler, and I am 68 years old now, sitting in a kitchen that has been too quiet for 31 years. The autumn I turned 24, my wife Rebecca stood in the doorway between our front room and the porch, holding a folded gray shawl against her chest, and asked me, in a voice so steady it frightened me, if I would let her go back to her mother's house for a while. Behind me, in the chair he had claimed the day he moved in with us, my father set down his coffee cup without looking up and said, "A good husband never allows it, Joseph." Rebecca did not look at him. She looked at me. And what I did in the next 4 seconds is the reason I am telling this story now, while there is still anyone left alive who remembers her name. We had been married 14 months. I want you to understand that before I say anything else, because the way our district told the story afterward made it sound like years of hardship. Like Rebecca had every reason to be worn down. She did not. She had reasons, yes, but not the ones the women whispered about at quilting frolics. Rebecca was 22, small-boned, with hands that were never still, and she had come to me from a farm 7 miles east, the second daughter of a widower named Amos Lapp. We were not a love match in the English sense, but on the morning of our wedding, when she lifted her eyes to mine during the vows, I saw something I had not expected. A willingness, almost a hope, that this would be a good life. I held on to that look for a long time. I am still holding it. The first crack in our household did not come from Rebecca. It came from my mother. 3 weeks after the wedding, my mother walked through Rebecca's kitchen and rearranged the spice tins on the shelf above the stove. She did it without speaking. Rebecca watched her from the doorway, a dishcloth in her hand, and afterward, when my mother had gone, Rebecca put each tin back exactly where she had placed it that morning. She did not complain to me. She did not even mention it. I only knew because I had been sitting in the side room mending a harness, and I saw the whole thing through the open door. That night, when I asked my mother why she had done it, she said she arranges them like her own mother. She is not at her mother's house now. I remember thinking it was strange but small. I remember thinking my mother loved me and meant well, and that Rebecca would adjust. This is the part of the story I have to tell carefully, because it would be easy to make my mother the villain, and she was not. Not entirely. My mother, Anna, had been married to my father for 30 years by then, and she had learned to survive him by becoming his quiet enforcer in every room he was not in. She protected him by making the world rearrange itself before he had to ask. She believed, I think, that she was protecting me too, since she believed that if Rebecca learned the household quickly, my father would have no reason to involve himself. She was wrong about that, and I think part of her always knew she was wrong. My father, Eli Byler, had been a deacon for 11 years. He was not the bishop, but in our district the deacon carried the weight of correction, and my father carried it like a man who had been waiting his whole life to be handed something heavy. He was not loud. He was not cruel in the way the English imagine cruelty. He simply believed, with a certainty that left no room in the room for anyone else, that he knew what a household should look like, and that any deviation from that picture was a small rebellion against God. When my mother told him a thing, he listened. When I told him a thing, he corrected it. When Rebecca told him a thing, and she tried, in the early months, he looked past her shoulder until she stopped speaking. The first time I understood that Rebecca had noticed this, we were walking home from a Sunday service in late November. The fields were stubbled and brown, and she was holding the side of her bonnet against a wind that kept lifting it. She said without turning her head, "Joseph, your father does not hear me." I told her he was an old man and he had ways. She said, "He hears your mother. He hears the bishop. He hears the dog when it barks at night. He does not hear me." I laughed because I did not know what else to do, and I told her she was imagining it. She walked the rest of the way home without speaking. That was the first warning, and I rationalized it before her feet touched our porch. By Christmas, my father had moved into our front bedroom. I should explain how that happened, because in the telling it sounds like an invasion, and it did not feel like one at the time. My parents' farmhouse, 2 miles down the road, had developed a problem with the chimney, and the smoke had begun to back into the upper rooms. My father announced, he did not ask, that he and my mother would stay with us while the repairs were arranged. The repairs took 4 months. Then the roof needed attention. Then my mother's knees became too poor for the stairs at the old place. Then it was spring planting, and it made no sense, my father said, for him to travel back and forth when there was a perfectly good bedroom in his son's house. Rebecca and I gave up our larger bedroom and moved into the small one at the back, the one we had planned to use for a nursery. Rebecca folded the baby quilt her aunt had given us and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of our new, smaller bed. She did not cry. She closed the lid carefully, the way you close a door on a room you do not expect to enter again soon. This is where the trust ladder began to shift, although I did not see it then. I had been raised to believe that my father was the steady center of any room he entered, and that my mother was his loyal second. I had been raised to believe that Rebecca, as my wife, would slot naturally beneath us both, and that her happiness would arrive through obedience, the way mine had, or so I told myself. What I had not yet understood was that there were already two alliances operating inside my house, and neither of them included me. The first alliance I noticed was between my mother and Rebecca, and it surprised me. It began over bread. Rebecca baked on Tuesdays and Fridays, the way her mother had taught her, and my mother baked on Wednesdays and Saturdays, the way she had always done. For a few weeks they tried to share the oven, and the kitchen filled with a tension I could feel from the barn. Then one Wednesday morning in February, I came in from the milking and found them sitting at the table together, drinking coffee, and my mother was showing Rebecca how to fold a particular kind of dough that my grandmother had made. Rebecca was listening. My mother's hand was on Rebecca's wrist, lightly, the way you touch someone you are trying not to frighten. They did not see me in the doorway. My mother said, very quietly, "Child, when he speaks to you the way he spoke last night, you come to me. Do not answer him. Come to me." Rebecca nodded once. My mother removed her hand and went back to the dough as if nothing had been said. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I went back out to the barn and pretended I had not heard. That was the first reversal, and I want you to understand what it meant. The woman I had assumed was my father's quiet enforcer was, in some private chamber of herself, trying to shield my wife from him. She had been doing it, I later realized, for months. The rearranged spice tins had not been a correction, they had been a warning, a way of teaching Rebecca which arrangements would draw my father's eye and which would not. My mother had been speaking to Rebecca in a language I had never learned, because I had never needed to. And yet, and this is the part that took me 30 years to admit, my mother never once said any of this to me. She protected Rebecca from my father in small, sideways ways, but she never asked me to protect my wife. She never said, "Joseph, your father is harming her." She allowed me to remain a child in my own house, because asking me to become a man would have required her to acknowledge what her own husband was. The second alliance I noticed was between my father and the bishop, and that one frightened me. Bishop Stoltzfus was a soft-spoken man with a long white beard and a way of laying his hand on your shoulder that felt like a blessing and a weight at the same time. He and my father had grown up together, fished the same creek as boys, sat on the same bench for 40 years. In late April, the bishop began coming to our house on Thursday afternoons for coffee. He had never done this before my father moved in. He and my father would sit in the front room for 2 hours, and Rebecca would serve them. And afterward, my father would find some small thing about Rebecca's service to correct. The coffee was not hot enough. She had set the cream too far from the bishop's hand. She had spoken when she should have only nodded. The corrections were never loud. They were delivered at supper, in front of me, in the same tone my father used to discuss the weather. One Thursday in May, I came into the front room to fetch a ledger, and I heard the bishop say, "Eli, the girl is young. Be patient with her." And my father said, "She is not young. She is a wife." Patience is what ruined her father's house after Sarah died. Died. The bishop did not answer. He drank his coffee. I left the ledger where it was and went back outside. That night I asked Rebecca if she was well. She said she was. I asked if my father had spoken sharply to her. She said he had not. She was lying, and I knew she was lying, and I let the lie sit between us because pulling at it would have required me to do something I was not yet willing to do. In June, Rebecca's sister Mary came to visit for 3 days. Mary was older, married to a man in a district 40 miles north, and she had a way of looking at a room that made you straighten your collar. On the second evening, while my father was at a council meeting, Mary sat with Rebecca on the porch swing for almost 2 hours. I could not hear what they said. When Mary came inside to fetch a shawl, she stopped beside my chair and said, very quietly, "Joseph, your wife is not flourishing here." I told her Rebecca was tired, that she had been helping with the garden. Mary looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "A husband who cannot see his wife is a husband who has chosen not to see her." She went out to the porch. I did not follow. That was the second reversal, and it was not the one I expected. Mary was not the rescuer I would have imagined. After those 3 days, Mary went home and wrote Rebecca exactly 2 letters in the months that followed, neither of which Rebecca answered in my hearing. Years later, I learned that Mary had written to my father directly, asking him to give Rebecca leave to visit the Lapp farm for a season. My father had written back that a wife's place was beside her husband, and that any other arrangement would dishonor the marriage. Mary had not pressed. She had her own household, her own husband, her own bishop, and her own quiet calculations. She had warned me once, and once was the most she could afford. I do not blame her now. At the time, I did not even know there was anything to blame her for. By midsummer, Rebecca had stopped speaking at meals. She still served. She still listened. She still answered if my father asked her a direct question. But the small remarks, the comments on the weather, the little observations about the neighbors, the soft laughter she used to bring to our table, those had gone. My mother noticed. She began making excuses to keep Rebecca in the kitchen with her after meals, drying dishes that did not need drying, sorting beans that did not need sorting. My father noticed too. One evening in July, he set his fork down and said, "Joseph, your wife has grown sullen. A sullen wife is a sign of a husband who has not taken his place." I felt my face grow hot. Rebecca, standing at the stove with her back to us, did not turn. My mother did. My mother said, "Eli, the child is tired. Let her be." It was the first time in my life I had heard my mother speak across my father at his own table. My father looked at her. He did not answer. He picked up his fork and finished his supper. But that night, through the wall, I heard him speaking to her in their bedroom for almost an hour, in a low, even voice that never rose and never stopped. And in the morning, my mother's eyes were red, and she did not look at Rebecca for 2 full days. That was when I understood, finally, that my mother's protection had a ceiling, and that the ceiling was my father. I want to tell you about the false hope now, because every story like mine has one, and ours came in August. My father's brother in Indiana fell ill, and my father announced he would travel west for 3 weeks to help with the harvest there. My mother would remain with us. For 21 days the house breathed. Rebecca laughed again at the table. She sang while she hung the wash. She and my mother spent the long evenings on the porch, shelling peas and talking about nothing. And once I heard Rebecca call my mother ma'am, not the way a daughter-in-law says it for politeness, but the way a daughter says it because she has run out of other words. My mother heard it too. She put her hand on Rebecca's knee and left it there. On the 18th evening, Rebecca told me she was carrying a child. I sat down on the edge of our bed and I wept, which I had not done since I was a boy. Rebecca knelt in front of me and put her forehead against mine, and we stayed that way for a long time. She said very softly, "Joseph, when the baby comes, we must have our own house. Just us, just the 3 of us." I told her yes. I told her I would speak to my father. I told her I would find a way. I meant every word of it in that moment, and I want you to know that, because what came next was not because I had stopped meaning it. It was because I had never learned how to mean a thing harder than my father meant the opposite. My father came home on the 22nd day. He had been in the house for less than an hour when he sat me down in the front room and told me that the bishop had spoken with him in Indiana, by letter, by some arrangement I never fully understood, about my household. He said the bishop was concerned that I had not yet become the head of my own house. He said the bishop had suggested that perhaps a firmer hand was needed, and that perhaps it was time for me to begin attending the deacons' meetings as an observer, so that I might learn. He said all of this without ever mentioning Rebecca's name. And then he said, "Your mother tells me there may be a child." I had not told him. My mother had. I felt something inside me go very still. I did not tell Rebecca that night that I knew about the bishop's letter, or that my mother had carried her news to my father before Rebecca had been ready. I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself. This was the 3rd reversal, and it was the one that broke me, although I did not break visibly for a long time. My mother, the woman who had touched Rebecca's wrist over the dough, who had spoken across my father at his own table, who had let Rebecca call her ma'am on the porch. My mother had told my father about the child within hours of his return. She had done it, I believe now, because she was afraid. She had felt her own ceiling that night through the bedroom wall, and she had decided, in whatever private chamber held her decisions, that she could not afford to keep a secret of that size from him. She had chosen her marriage over Rebecca. She had chosen survival over shelter. And I understood it even then, in a way that hurt worse than if I had not understood it at all, because I was about to do the same thing. The autumn came on quickly that year. Rebecca grew quieter as her body grew heavier. My father grew louder, not in volume but in presence. He began correcting her in front of the bishop on Thursdays. He began asking at meals whether she had read her Bible that morning, and what passage, and what it had taught her, and then telling her what it should have taught her. My mother stopped intervening. She kept her eyes on her plate. Once I saw her reach under the table and squeeze Rebecca's hand, and then pull her own hand back as if she had touched a stove. The night Rebecca asked to leave was the second Tuesday of October. She had baked that morning. The kitchen still smelled of it. My father had spent the afternoon in the front room with the bishop, and at supper he had told Rebecca, in front of all of us, that her bread had been heavy, and that a heavy loaf was a sign of a heavy spirit, and that a heavy spirit in a woman carrying a child was a danger to the child. Rebecca had set down her fork. She had stood up. She had gone upstairs without a word, and when she came down again she was carrying the gray shawl, folded, against her chest, and she had walked to the doorway between the front room and the porch, and she had asked me, in that steady voice, if I would let her go to her mother's house for a while. And my father said, without looking up, "A good husband never allows it, Joseph. I want to tell you that I stood up. I want to tell you that I crossed the room and took the shawl from her hands and put it around her shoulders and walked her out to the buggy myself. I want to tell you that I drove her the 7 miles east to the Lapp farm that night, and that I stood on her father's porch in the cold and asked Amos Lapp to keep her safe until I had made a house worthy of her. I did not do any of those things. I said, Rebecca, wait until morning. We will talk in the morning." And my father, still without looking up, said, "There is nothing to talk about in the morning. Sit down, daughter. Finish your supper." And Rebecca looked at me, only at me, for what I now know was the last honest look she would ever give me. And then she turned, and she walked back to the table, and she sat down, and she finished her supper, and she did not speak again that night. The child came in March, a boy. We named him Amos for her father. He lived 4 days. Rebecca did not speak for almost 3 weeks after the burial. When she began speaking again, she spoke only of small things: the weather, the chickens, the price of sugar. She never asked me again to take her to her mother's house. She never asked me for anything again. She lived with me for another 26 years, and she was a good wife by every measure our community used. And when she died of a fever in the autumn of 1995, she was holding my hand, and her last words to me were, "Joseph, it is all right. It was a long time ago. It was not all right. It had not been a long time ago. It had been every day." My father died in 1988. My mother died 2 years after him. Before she died, she called me to her bedside and she said, "Joseph, I should have made you take her home that night. I knew. I should have made you." I told her she had done what she could. She shook her head. She said, "What I could was not enough. Tell her when you see her that I am sorry. Tell her I knew." She died that evening. I have never told Rebecca, because by the time my mother spoke those words, Rebecca and I no longer spoke of such things, and I was a coward in a different way than I had been at 24, but a coward still. I understand the people in my story now, as well as a man can understand anyone. My father believed he was holding a household together. My mother believed she was surviving a marriage she could not leave. The bishop believed he was guiding a young deacon's family through a difficult season. Mary believed she had warned the only person who could have acted. Rebecca believed, for one evening in October, that I might be a different kind of husband than my father had taught me to be. And I believed that obedience to my father was the same as love for my wife, and that a good husband was a man who held his household in place, when in fact a good husband is a man who knows when to open a door and walk his wife through it. I sit in this kitchen now, and the spice tins are exactly where Rebecca placed them on the first morning of our marriage. I have not moved them in 31 years. They are the only argument I ever won on her behalf. And I won it after she was gone, against no one, in a house where no one is listening. A good husband never allows it, my father said. He was right about the sentence, and wrong about every word in it. What a good husband never allows is the silence I allowed that night. What a good husband never allows is the 4 seconds in which I did not stand up, the shawl, the doorway, the look. I see them still. I will see them, I think, until the morning someone finds me in this chair, and the kitchen at last becomes as quiet as I have pretended it was for 31 years.